bill.
Call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I'm very happy to take a brief call on the Support for Children and Hardship Bill. When we're talking about the title and commencement clauses of this legislation, I have to say, Mr Chairman, I'm a big fan of the non-political naming of bills in New Zealand. It's been a tradition in the New Zealand Parliament that the way we name bills is we use factual descriptions for bills in Parliament, not sort of political sloganeering. And I think one of the best examples of where you see the political sloganeering in the way bills are created is obviously the United States Congress, where you get bills like the No Child Left Behind bill, or which became the No Child Left Behind Act, which doesn't actually really tell you very much about what the bill does. The point that I want to make in this is the Support for Children and Hardship Bill basically creates an expectation around what the legislation is actually going to do that doesn't necessarily match up with what the legislation actually does. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I think the bill is misnamed. And in fact, we should just go back to the Kiwi tradition, the New Zealand parliamentary tradition, of naming bills after what they actually do. So in this case, it primarily is a bill to amend the Social Security Act. So previously, this would have been called the Social Security Act 1964 Amendment Bill. That would be what Parliament would have called it. The naming of it by something else actually politicises the title of the bill, and therefore creates expectations around it. So it's a marketing ploy rather than a good legislative ploy. And then, therefore, the House then brings itself to the question of, well, does the substance of the bill match up to the marketing that we're getting within the title? And if we look at it, we say, okay, so the bill talks about support for children in hardship. One would think that that applies to all children in hardship, and yet the estimates suggest that this might apply to about 18,000 families of children with children, and yet there could be up to 305,000 children living in hardship in New Zealand, depending on whose measure you are willing to accept. Therefore, the bill fails at its first hurdle, in the sense that I don't believe that it's appropriately named. But I actually have a technical issue that I want to get some clarity from the Minister about, and that is to do with the commencement. So if we look under clause 1, or section 1 of the bill, where we're talking about when part 1 comes into effect, it comes into effect on the 1st of April 2016, if an order in council was made under section 61HA2 of the Social Security Act, which incidentally, section 61HA2 of the Social Security Act is actually being inserted by this very bill. So, but that's the point that I'm about to come to. If an order in council is made under that section, then the Act comes into force on the same date, but part 1 comes into force immediately before that order. Now, the reason that is interesting is it's suggesting that the government can make an order in council to come into force before this bill has actually come into force as a piece of law. That to me seems quite an interesting legislative instrument. Now, I suspect that the reason the government are doing this is so that they can determine what they want the order in council to be on the 1st of April when the bill comes into force, and they are just trying to avoid any sort of legal irregularities around the fact that the order in council was made immediately prior to the bill actually coming into force, or the Act, as it will then be, actually coming into force. But it seems to me a slightly interesting legislative instrument. It's the first time that I've seen something like that basically gives the government the ability to make an order in council under an Act that hasn't yet come into force. And I just want to check with the Minister that in fact the intention in doing this is to ensure that that basically the order in council can be prepared prior to the Act coming into force, but it's just to avoid the technicality, I guess, of the Act and the order in council coming into force at the same time, and there potentially being some sort of circular legal argument that somehow invalidates the situation. So the rest of the commencement clause basically is relatively straightforward. There's either it either comes into force the day after which it receives the royal assent, i.e. that it's signed by the Governor-General, or on the 1st of April 2016, which is not unusual when it comes to Social Security Act amendments, because they tend to be for the full year. Having said that, I think that some very legitimate arguments have been raised for why we always treat the expenditure side of the equation, Mr Chair,
Chris Hipkins,
as coming into force some way down the track, but there's often, when it comes to the other end of the equation and the revenue generation side of things, the government seems to be a lot harsher, and we dealt with some issues just recently, in fact, where there was legislation that was backdated, and I think that's generally a bad principle. So overall, I think the bill is worth supporting because the cause is worth supporting. Support for children in hardship is something that the Parliament should take seriously. I am disappointed in the sense that I don't believe that the bill lives up to the promise in the title. I don't believe it supports enough of the children in hardship. I think it overlooks many of the impacts. Because again, let's come back to the title, Children in Hardship Bill. Actually, why do children live in hardship? It's not because the children don't earn enough money. It's actually because the parents don't earn enough money to support them, which is another reason why I think, and in fact the bill deals largely with parental income issues. And I don't know that the title of the bill adequately reflects what this bill actually does. If we want to get really serious about dealing with children in hardship, we do have to look very seriously about the fact that 305,000 New Zealand children, if you accept the most commonly accepted definition of poverty, are living below the poverty line in New Zealand. That is a major, major embarrassment to a country like New Zealand, and we should certainly be doing a lot more about that. We need to look at early childhood education and the barriers to participation in early childhood education and the link between workforce participation and early childhood education. And I don't think that those are sufficiently understood yet. And I think we need to look much more closely at those. So the bill is worth supporting. It has a lot of gaps in it. It's a start, but it's certainly by no means a big step.